She's soft in all the ways you never learned to be. That was the first thing Elara heard when she stepped into the moonlit archway of Thornmoor's great hall, and the words went through her like a blade of winter through wet linen. She stopped. Her hand found the cold stone of the pillar beside her, and gripped it as though the floor had tilted beneath her boots. On the far end of the hall, beneath the antler chandeliers and the silver banners of the Northreach pack, Kael Draven, Alpha King, her mate, the man whose scent she had memorized like scripture, was turning slowly in a slow dance with Selene. Selene, who had braided her hair when they were pups. Selene, who had cried on Elara's shoulder the night her mother died. Selene, her best friend, folded now into the arms of Elara's husband, as if she had always belonged there. The bond in Elara's chest, that living thread of gold that tied her soul to Kael's, did not snap all at once. It frayed. She felt it unravel strand by strand, each filament tearing loose with a small, private agony, and with every broken thread, a piece of the last 4 years bled out of her and vanished into the cold air of the hall. She did not scream. She did not gasp. She stood very still and watched the two people she had trusted most in the world sway together to a song she had not been invited to hear. And she understood, with the terrible clarity of someone waking from a dream they had mistaken for a life, that this had not begun tonight. "You feel more like home than she ever did," Kael murmured. And Selene laughed, that low, silvery laugh Elara had loved once, and pressed her cheek to his chest. The Alpha King's hand slid to the small of her friend's back with the ease of long practice. Not a first touch, a familiar one. The wound in Elara's chest went cold, then colder, until it felt like frostbite spreading outward from the place where the bond had lived. She should have felt rage. Later she would wonder why she did not, why the fury she was owed did not arrive to warm her. Instead, there was only a vast and echoing quiet, the kind of silence that follows an avalanche, when the mountain has finished falling and there is nothing left to fall. In that quiet, a single clear thought rose, whole and hard as riverstone. Not one word, not one tear where they can see it. If I am nothing to you, then let me be nothing you can ever hold again. She stepped back into the shadow of the archway before either of them turned. Her boots made no sound on the flagstones. She had learned long ago how to move through Thornmoor unseen, how to be the quiet wife who managed the ledgers and settled the disputes and stitched the wounds of the pack while the Alpha King took the glory. That invisibility, which had once shamed her, was suddenly the most useful thing she owned. She walked the long gallery back toward the private wing, with her spine straight and her breath even, and inside her the last golden thread of the mate bond gave a final shiver and went dark. In the mirror of the antechamber, she caught her own reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Elara Vane, they called her now. Luna of Northreach, queen of the largest wolf pack in the eastern reaches, married to the most feared alpha in 3 territories. Her gown was silver silk. Her throat wore the moonstone collar Kael had clasped there on their bonding night, whispering that she was the only woman who would ever wear it. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were not shaking. That surprised her more than anything. She had expected to shatter. Instead, she felt herself hardening, cooling, setting like metal poured into a mold she had not known was waiting inside her all along. She thought of the 4 years she had given this pack, the winters she had spent balancing the grain stores so that no pup went hungry while Kael feasted rival alphas into submission, the night she had ridden out in a blizzard to broker peace with the Ashfell clan, because Cale's temper had nearly started a war, and she had come home half-frozen to find him already asleep, never asking where she had been. The countless times she had smoothed over his cruelties, translated his threats into diplomacy, made him look wise when he had only been lucky. She had built the peace of Northreach with her own 2 hands, while everyone praised the strength of its king, and he had danced with her best friend and called that stranger home. You feel more like home than she ever did. She turned the sentence over in her mind, examining it the way she examined a poisoned wound, deciding how deep it went and whether it could be saved. It could not. Some things once said cannot be unsaid, and some bonds, once broken, do not mend. They scar, and the scar becomes a boundary, and the boundary becomes a door out of the cage. Because that was the truth she had refused to see until this night. Thorn Moor was a cage, a beautiful one, with warm hearths and rich tapestries, and 100 voices that called her Luna with reverence, but a cage all the same, because a cage is any place you are not allowed to leave as yourself. She had mistaken the gold of the bars for the gold of a crown. Kyle had just handed her the key without knowing it, and she intended to use it before the sun rose. She did not weep as she climbed the stairs to the room she had shared with him. She was done weeping for a man who danced while she bled. In the doorway she paused and looked once more toward the distant music, and she made herself a vow so quiet that even the wolf inside her barely heard it. You will look for me one day, Kyle Draven. You will search every road in the eastern reaches for the woman who kept your kingdom breathing. And when at last you find her, she will be so far above you that you will have to kneel just to speak her name. She reached up, unclasped the moonstone collar, and let it fall from her fingers onto the cold stone floor, where it landed with a small, final, ringing sound, like a door closing on a life. The moonstone collar lay on the flagstones, exactly where she had let it fall, and Elara did not pick it up. That was the first rule she made for herself in the hour after her heart broke. She would take nothing that Cale Draven had given her. Not the collar, not the silver gowns hanging in the wardrobe like the shed skins of a woman who no longer existed. Not the jeweled circlet the pack had placed on her brow the day they named her Luna. Everything in this room had been given to her as a reward for being useful and obedient and quiet. She would leave it all here, glittering and abandoned, so that when he finally noticed her absence, he would understand that she had wanted none of it, that she had only ever wanted him, and that even that she was now taking back. She moved through the darkened chamber with the calm efficiency of a woman who had, without ever quite admitting it to herself, been preparing for this night for a very long time. Deep in the back of the wardrobe, behind the ceremonial furs, there was a loose panel in the wall that only she knew about. She pressed it, and it swung open on the small hidden hollow she had discovered 2 years ago, and never told a soul. Inside was a worn leather satchel, and inside the satchel was everything she would need to disappear. Plain travel clothes of undyed wool, a purse heavy with coins she had set aside a little at a time from the household accounts, her own earnings, not his gifts, wages she had never once been formally paid, but had quietly reckoned as owed, a folded map of the southern trade roads, and a sealed letter she had written to herself on a night 8 months ago, when she had first begun to suspect that something in her marriage had gone quietly rotten. She had not been able to name the rot then. She had only felt it, the way you feel a change in the weather before the sky darkens, the way Kyle's eyes slid past her at feasts, the way Selene had begun arriving at the keep at odd hours with thin excuses, the way the two of them fell silent when Elara entered a room, and then spoke too brightly, too fast. She had told herself she was imagining it. A good wife did not accuse. A good Luna did not stir the pack with jealousy. So she had said nothing, and she had done the only thing her frightened, practical heart knew how to do. She had prepared a way out, hidden it, and prayed she would never need it. The prayer had failed, but the preparation had not. She changed out of the silver gown, folding it neatly and laying it across the bed like a body at a wake. In the plain wool she felt, absurdly, more herself than she had in years. She braided her dark hair back tight and pulled the hood of her travel cloak low. Then she sat at the small writing desk by the window, and, by the light of a single candle, she did the last work she would ever do for the pack of Northreach. She wrote out the grain distributions for the coming winter in her clear, careful hand, noting which families needed extra, which stores were running low, which debts the neighbouring clans still owed. She wrote out the terms of the fragile peace with Ashfell and the names of the men who could be trusted to keep it. She left a record so complete that the pack would not starve or stumble into war in the months it would take them to realize how much she had been holding together. It was more than they deserved. But she had never been able to punish the innocent for the sins of the powerful, and the pups of Northreach had done nothing to her. There was a soft knock at the servant's door. Elara went still, her hand dropping to the small knife at her belt. Then a familiar voice, low and rough with age, whispered through the wood. "It's only me, Luna." She opened the door and let in Bram, the old keeper of the keep's stables, a grizzled wolf twice her age, whose muzzle had gone grey in the service of 3 alphas. His face was grave, and his eyes, when they found hers, held a sorrow that told her he had seen the great hall too. Perhaps he had seen it many times. "I saddled the roan," he said quietly. "The fast one. She's waiting at the low gate where the guards don't walk till dawn." He pressed something into her hand, a second purse, small but heavy. "It isn't much. It's mine. You paid for my son's medicine 2 winters back, and never let me thank you. Let me thank you now." Elara's composure nearly broke then, at the one kindness she hadn't armored herself against. She closed her fingers around the old man's rough hand. "Bram, if they ask where I went, they won't ask me," he said. "And if they do, my memory's poor these days. Terrible thing, getting old." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face, and then it fell away. "Go far, child. Go where the Draven name means nothing. You were the best of them, and they never once knew it. That was their loss to take. Don't let it be yours to carry." She embraced him, quickly, fiercely, the way you embrace the last warm thing before stepping into the cold. Then she slung the satchel over her shoulder, blew out the candle, and slipped down the narrow servant's stair, while the music still drifted up from the great hall, thin and golden, and utterly indifferent to the fact that the woman who had held their whole world together was walking out of it forever. The low gate stood open. The roan mare shifted and snorted in the dark, her breath pluming in the cold. Elara set her foot in the stirrup and swung up, and for one moment she looked back at Thornmoor, the great black shape of it against the stars, its windows glowing gold, its towers full of people who loved a lie and had never bothered to learn the truth. She thought of Kyle's hand on Selene's back. She thought of the words that would follow her the rest of her life. And then she turned the mare's head south toward the trade roads and the trees and the vast unknown country beyond the borders of the only home she had ever known, and she rode into the dark without looking back again. the forest swallowed her. The cold bit at her cheeks, and the mare's hooves drummed a steady rhythm on the frozen road, and mile by mile the golden glow of Thornmoor sank behind the hills until it was gone entirely, and there was only the black country and the white stars, and the woman riding alone through both. Somewhere past midnight, when the keep was far behind her, and the last thread of the broken bond had cooled to ash in her chest, Elara finally let herself feel it. Not the grief, not yet, but the size of what she had done. She had left. She had walked away from a crown and a king and the only life she knew, with nothing but a satchel and an old man's kindness and a vow she had made to no one but herself. The enormity of it should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time in 4 years, she breathed all the way to the bottom of her lungs, and the air tasted like something she had almost forgotten. It tasted like freedom. The road south was long, and it did not care about her sorrow. This, she came to understand, was the mercy of it. The world beyond Thornmoor did not know that she had been a queen. It knew only that she was a woman with strong hands and a sharp mind and a willingness to work, and it asked nothing of her but that she keep going. So she kept going. She sold the roan mare in a river town 3 days south, weeping a little as she handed over the reins, because the animal had carried her out of her old life, and she was ashamed to part with it, and she used the coin to buy passage on a barge that drifted down the wide, slow river toward the great mercantile city of Solhaven, where the eastern reaches ended and the whole trading world began. She had never seen anything like Solhaven. It rose out of the river delta in tiers of white stone and red tile, a city that belonged to no single pack and no single alpha, where wolves and humans and the folk of a dozen bloodlines bought and sold and bargained beneath a forest of ship masts. Here, a woman's rank meant nothing, and her competence meant everything. Here, no one had ever heard the name Draven spoken with fear. Elara Vane, for she kept only her own family name, and let the title fall away like the collar on the cold stone floor, walked off the barge into the roar of the great market, and understood that she had found the one place in the world where she could become someone new. She was not naive. She knew the coin in her satchel would not last, and she knew that a woman alone in a strange city was a woman 1,000 people would try to cheat. So she was careful. She took a small room above a spice merchant's shop, paid a month in advance, and spent her first weeks doing nothing but watching. She watched the great trading houses move their goods through the port. She watched the caravan masters haggle in the caravanserai. She learned who was honest and who was not, which houses were rising and which were quietly rotting from the inside. And slowly, the same instinct that had let her hold a pack together began to map the bones of a city. The thing about Elara, the thing Kyle had never understood, the thing that had made her invisible to him precisely because it was so valuable, was that she saw systems. Where other people saw a chaos of ships and carts and shouting merchants, she saw the flow of grain and salt and iron, the debts and the promises, the places where the current snagged and money pooled and rotted for want of someone clever enough to move it. She had spent 4 years running the invisible machinery of a kingdom. A city's markets were no different, only larger, and here at last there was no Alpha to take the credit for her work. She got her first foothold almost by accident. The spice merchant below her rooms, a shrewd old widow named Ottoline Marsh, was drowning in a dispute with a caravan house that owed her a shipment of saffron and refused to pay for a cargo of cardamom she had already delivered. Elara heard the woman weeping through the floorboards one night, and came down and, without quite meaning to, ask to see the ledgers. She read them in an hour. Then she read the contracts. Then she pointed out, quietly, the clause the caravan house had violated, and the 3 others they had left themselves exposed on, and she showed the widow exactly how to bind them. "You should let me handle it," Ilara said. "I'll take 1/10 of what I recover. If I recover nothing, you owe me nothing." Ottoline Marsh looked at this hooded stranger with the Queen's spine and the ledger reader's eyes, and something in her recognized something. "Who were you?" she asked, "before you came to my door?" "No one worth remembering," said Ilara, "but I'm very good at this." She recovered every coin, and 2 months' penalty besides. Word spread. In a city built on contracts and trust, and the endless untangling of who owed what to whom, a woman who could read a bad bargain, the way a healer reads a wound, was worth more than gold, and Ilara Vane was better at it than anyone Solhaven had ever seen. Within half a year she had a name, not as a Luna, not as anyone's wife, but as the sharpest broker on the river, the woman the trading houses came to when a deal had gone sour, and they needed someone to make it whole again. She took a percentage of everything she saved them, and she saved them a great deal, and the coin that flowed to her she did not spend on silver gowns. She invested it in grain futures, in shipping shares, in the small failing enterprises she could see were only failing for lack of a clever hand. She was building something, not a cage this time, a fortress. It was in Solhaven that she met the person who would become the second most important in her new life. His name was Tarian Cole, and he was the master of a mid-sized trading house that was, when Ilara first walked into it, 3 bad seasons away from ruin. He was a broad, plain-spoken man with ink-stained hands and no patience for pretense, and when Ilara laid out in cold detail exactly how his house was bleeding money and exactly how to stop it, he did not bristle at being corrected by a woman he'd never met. He listened. He asked good questions, and when she finished, he sat back and looked at her with a frank, unguarded admiration that had nothing of Cale's possessiveness in it and everything of simple respect. Half the men in this city would rather sink than take advice from someone smarter than them, he said. I'd rather float. Partner with me. Not work for me. With me. Take a share of the house. She studied him for a long moment. This man who valued her mind more than her rank, because he did not know she had ever possessed a rank at all. It was a strange feeling, being wanted for the one thing about herself that Thornmore had trained her to hide. I don't want to be anyone's Luna again, she said, and it came out sharper than she intended. I've no idea what a Luna is, Tarian said mildly, and I don't want one. I want a partner. There's a difference, and I suspect you know it better than most. He held out his ink-stained hand. She looked at it. Then she took it. They rebuilt his house together over the following months, and it did not merely recover, it climbed. Under Ilara's eye, the coal trading house began to eat the market share of its rivals, one careful bite at a time, buying up failing concerns, cornering the grain trade upriver, extending credit to the small, honest merchants the big houses ignored, and reaping their loyalty in return. And all the while, from the caravan masters and the river captains and the travelling folk who carried news along the trade roads, Ilara gathered word of the country she had left behind. She never asked for it directly. She only listened, the way she had learned to listen, and the picture that assembled itself in her mind was one she watched with a cold and growing stillness. Because the pack of Northreach, the great and terrible kingdom of the Alpha King Cale Draven, was falling apart. It had started, they said, about the time the Luna vanished. though few outside the keep connected the two, because few outside the keep had ever understood how much the vanished Luna had done. The grain stores had been mismanaged that first winter. Some families had gone hungry, and there had been grumbling. The fragile peace with the Ashfell clan had collapsed almost immediately, because the man who had held it together with careful letters and carefully remembered debts was gone, and Kyle had answered the first border dispute the only way he knew how, with teeth and threats, and now the two packs skirmished along their frontier and lost young wolves to the fighting every moon. The tribute from the lesser packs had dwindled because the ledgers that tracked it had fallen into confusion, and no one could say any more who owed what. Thornmoor was still a great black keep against the stars, but its foundations were rotting, and the rot had a shape, and the shape was the exact size and outline of the woman who had walked out the low gate one winter's night and never come back. Ilara heard all of it, and she felt no triumph. That surprised her. She had thought, in the first cold hours after she left, that word of Kyle's ruin would taste sweet. Instead, it tasted like nothing at all. She had loved that pack. She had loved those pups, those families, that fragile, hard-won peace. It gave her no joy to know they suffered, because the man who ruled them had been too proud and too foolish to see what he had. But she also did not go back. She had learned, at last, the difference between a wound you were meant to heal and a wound that would only reopen the moment you touched it. Northreach was the second kind, so she let it bleed, and she built her fortress. And she waited, not for revenge, exactly, but for the slow logic of the world to bring the consequences of Cale's choices home to his door. She had spent 4 years pushing that door shut against the storm. She was curious now to see what would happen when there was no one left to hold it. She did not have to wait as long as she thought. 9 months to the day after she rode out of Thornmoor, on a bright, cold morning near the turning of the year, a battered trade delegation from the pack of Northreach arrived in the great mercantile city of Solhaven, seeking a loan. They came to the coal trading house because it was the largest, the richest, the one house in Solhaven, with the deep reserves and the far-flung credit to underwrite a debt as vast as the one they meant to ask for. Ilara knew they were coming before they arrived. She made it her business to know who entered the city and why, and word of a Northreach delegation had reached her days earlier, along with the desperate shape of their need. She could have refused the meeting. She could have handed it to Tarion and stayed away, and no one in that delegation would ever have known she was in the same city. She considered it. Then she considered the 4 years and the collar on the cold stone floor and the vow she had made in the dark, and she decided, with the cool deliberation that had become the whole of her, that she would take the meeting herself. She dressed carefully that morning. Not in silver. She had never once worn silver since Thornmoor. She wore deep charcoal wool, plainly cut, expensively made, the uniform of a woman whose power lived in her mind, and not on her skin. She pinned her dark hair up and left her throat bare, and around it she wore nothing at all, no collar, no jewel, only the pale scar of skin where a moonstone had once marked her as another wolf's property. She looked at herself in the good glass in her chambers, for she had chambers now, a whole floor of a fine house above the river, earned and owned and beholden to no one, and the woman who looked back was a stranger to the frightened Luna of a year ago, and a stranger, she knew, to the man who would walk through her doors within the hour. The great receiving room of the coal house had a long table of dark wood, and, at its head, a tall chair that faced the tall windows and the bright river beyond, so that anyone who sat in it looked out at the city, while those who entered saw only its high carved back. Elara sat in that chair with a ledger open before her and her back to the door, and she listened as the delegation was shown in. There were 5 of them, travel-worn and grim, and at their head, because of course he had come himself, because his pride would never have let him send another man to beg, was Kyle Draven. She knew his tread before she saw him. She knew the weight of him, the old familiar gravity of the man who had once been the whole of her sky. She sat very still, and let him speak first, as she had let him speak first for 4 years, and she noted with cold interest that his voice, when it came, had lost some of its old certainty. It was hoarse, tired, the voice of a king who had not slept well in a long time. "I'm told the master of this house can arrange the kind of credit we require," Kale said to the room, to the back of the chair, to the woman he did not know was sitting in it. "We haven't come to haggle. Northreach is a name that means something. We'll pay a fair rate, and we'll pay it back. I need to speak to whoever holds the coin." Elara let the silence stretch. She let it stretch until she felt the delegation shift uneasily behind him, until even Kale's patience frayed, and he took a step closer. And then, slowly, she turned the tall chair around. She watched it happen across his face. The confusion first, as he took in the plain charcoal wool and the pinned dark hair, and could not place her. Then the recognition, arriving like a blow, the colour draining from his weathered face the way it had once drained from hers in the moonlit archway. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Behind him, one of his men made a low, astonished noise. Kyle Draven, Alpha King of Northreach, feared in 3 territories, stood in the receiving room of the woman he had discarded, and looked as though the floor had opened beneath his feet. "Elara," he said. Just her name. It cracked in the middle. "Sit," she said. Not unkindly, not warmly, the way one addresses a supplicant one has decided to hear out. "You've come a long way. I imagine you're tired." He did not sit. He stared at her, and she watched the terrible arithmetic run behind his eyes, the vanished Luna, the collapsing pack, the woman who now held the only coin that could save it. And she watched him understand, all at once, and far too late, exactly whose door he had come to beg at. They said the broker who saved the coal house was a woman named Vane. It was you. All of it was you. All of it was me, she agreed. Though you might have said that about a great many things over the years, if you'd ever thought to look. She closed the ledger with a soft, final sound. "Now, you wanted to speak to whoever holds the coin. You're speaking to her. Tell me why I should give a single piece of it to the pack of Northreach." Kale Draven sat down. It was not a decision so much as a collapse. His legs seemed simply to stop holding him, and he lowered himself into the chair at the far end of the long, dark table, as though it were a very great distance away, which in every way that mattered, it was. For a long moment he only looked at her, and Elara looked back at him, and the 4 other members of the delegation stood frozen behind their king, sensing that something enormous was happening in the room, and not one of them daring to speak. "You look well," Kyle said finally, and it was such a small, foolish, human thing to say that Elara almost pitied him. Almost. "I am well," she said. "I've never been better. But you didn't ride 300 miles to comment on my health. You came for money. So let's speak of money. How much does Northreach need, and what has become of it that it needs so badly?" She watched him gather himself, watched the old Alpha's pride try to armor a request that was, at its heart, a naked plea. "The winter was hard," he began. "The grain stores were mismanaged," she said. "Yes, I've heard. You had records. Careful records. I left them on the writing desk in the private wing, along with the distribution schedules and the notes on which families needed extra. Did no one think to read them?" His silence was answer enough. She nodded slowly, filing it away with all the rest. "And ash fell," she went on. "The peace held for 4 years and broke in less than 1. You've lost how many wolves to the border, fighting? 1 dozen? More?" She saw the flinch and knew she had struck close. "The tribute from the lesser packs has dried up because your ledgers are in chaos, and no one can say who owes you what, which means the great and terrible Alpha King is now, in the plainest terms, insolvent. You cannot feed your own pack through another winter. You cannot arm them for a war you started. And so you have come to the largest trading house in Solhaven to borrow your way out of a hole that you, and you alone, dug." She let the word settle. "Have I understood the situation correctly?" "Yes," Kyle said. The single word cost him a great deal. She could see that. "Yes, you have." "Then I have one more question," Elara said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, because whether I open my coffers to you depends entirely on the answer." She leaned forward slightly. "Where is Selene?" The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. She saw Kyle's jaw tighten. She saw 2 of the delegation exchange a quick, uneasy glance. And she understood, before he even spoke, that the story of Selene had not ended the way he had imagined it would that night in the great hall when he'd called a stranger home. "Gone," Kyle said at last, quietly. "She's gone." "Gone where?" "I don't know. Back to whatever place sent her, I expect." He looked at his hands. It wasn't what I thought it was, Elara. She wasn't what I thought she was." And then, because she had spent 4 years reading the truth beneath his words, because she had learned to hear the things Kael Draven did not know how to say, Elara began to see the true shape of what had happened at Thornmoor, and it was worse and stranger and colder than a simple faithless heart. She said nothing. She only waited and let him tell it, because a man who has come to beg will eventually tell you everything if you give him room enough. It came out of him in pieces over the next hour, in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had turned the same catastrophe over in his mind so many times that the horror of it had worn smooth. Selene, it transpired, had not been the ambitious best friend who stole a queen's husband, or she had been that. But she had been something more, something that had used the shape of that betrayal as a mask over a deeper design. She had come to Thornmoor in those last months at the quiet behest of a third party, a pack lord from the far northern territories named Vorna Castle, a cold and patient alpha who had wanted Northreach's lands and its river access and its command of the eastern trade roads for years, and who had understood, better than Kael ever had, that the true strength of Northreach was not its king, but its Luna. "He knew," Kyle said, and there was a kind of wondering horror in his voice. "Castle knew what you were. He knew you were the one holding it all together. So he sent Selena to pull me away from you, to break the thing between us. Because he understood that if you left, everything else would follow, that the pack would rot from the inside without ever being attacked. He never had to raise a single blade against Northreach. He only had to convince me to throw away the one thing that kept it standing." He laughed, a low and terrible sound with no humor in it at all, And I did it. I did exactly what he wanted. I danced with her in my own hall and told her she was home. And you heard it. You must have heard it. You were gone by morning. And I handed Vaughan Castle my entire kingdom without his ever lifting a hand. Elara sat very still. So this was the greater shape of it. Not merely a foolish man seduced by a prettier face, but a foolish man made into a weapon against himself by an enemy who had seen her worth more clearly than her own husband ever had. There was a bitter, poisonous irony in that, and she tasted all of it. Vaughan Castle had understood in one cold calculation what Kyle had failed to see across 4 years of marriage. That Elara Vane was the load-bearing wall of the whole edifice, and that you did not need to storm a fortress if you could simply persuade its lord to demolish it with his own hands. "And Selena?" she asked. "When did she leave?" "When there was nothing left worth staying for," Kyle said dully. "She'd done what she came to do. By the time I understood any of it, the pack was already failing, and she was already gone, back to Castle with her work finished. He's moving on the border now. The Ashfell fighting. It isn't really Ashfell. It's Castle's men, wearing Ashfell colours, keeping us bleeding while he waits for us to be too weak to stand. When we can't feed ourselves and can't arm ourselves, he'll simply walk in and take it, and he won't even have to fight, because a starving pack doesn't fight. It kneels." He lifted his eyes to hers at last, and they were the eyes of a man who had lost everything and knew precisely whose fault it was. "That's why I came to you, not knowing it was you. I came to borrow enough to feed my pack through the winter and arm them for the spring, so that when Castle comes, we can meet him standing. It's the last thing I can do for them. Beg from strangers so that Northreach doesn't die on its knees." For a long moment, Elara did not answer. She looked past him, out the tall windows at the bright river and the forest of ship masts, and the great free city she had built her new life in, and she thought about the pups of Northreach who would starve, and the young wolves who would die in a war their king had invited, and the cold, patient lord in the north who had understood her value and used it as a knife. She thought about the woman she had been, and the woman she was now, and the difference between vengeance and justice, which she had spent 9 months learning to tell apart. "You built the gallows," she said quietly, almost to herself, "and Vaughan Castle handed you the rope. But you're the one who put your own neck in it, Kyle. Never forget that. Whatever happens now, you did this." "I know," he said. "I know that. There isn't an hour of the day I don't know it." She stood then and walked slowly to the tall windows and looked out at her city with her back to the king who had once been her whole world, and she let him wait, because she was thinking, and because the woman who held the coin does not hurry for anyone. "I'm not going to give you a loan," she said at last. Behind her she heard the delegation's breath catch, heard the small, despairing sound one of them made, heard Kyle go very still. "Elara." "I'm not going to give you a loan," she repeated, turning to face him, "because a loan is a chain, and I am done with chains. Mine and everyone else's. A loan would keep you exactly as you are. Proud, foolish, ruling badly, borrowing against a future you don't know how to build. It would feed your pack through one winter and leave them to starve the next, because the problem with Northreach was never that it lacked coin. The problem with Northreach was that it had a king who couldn't see what was in front of him, and a system that had no one left to run it. She let that land. So no. I won't lend you money. I'll offer you something else. And I think, when you understand what it is, you'll find it's the only thing that can actually save the people you've come here to save." Caeldraven looked at her, the way a drowning man looks at the shore. "Tell me," he said. What she offered him was not mercy, though it wore the shape of mercy, and it was not revenge, though it accomplished, coldly and completely, everything her vow in the dark had promised. It was something more precise than either. It was a reckoning, drawn up like a contract, with every clause weighted to the exact measure of what she had learned about worth and power in the 9 months since she'd walked out the low gate. "I will save Northreach," she said, returning to the tall chair and sitting, folding her hands on the closed ledger. "The pack, the pups, the families, the peace. I'll pour enough of the Coalhouse's coin and grain into the eastern reaches to feed every wolf under your banner through this winter and the next, and I'll arm them properly, and I'll do what you never managed to do. I'll turn back Vaughan Castle, not with teeth, but with the only weapon that ever actually beats a patient man, which is a system he can't outlast. I'll restore the tribute ledgers. I'll reforge the Ashfell peace, because I still remember every debt and every name, and Castle's men in borrowed colours won't survive one honest accounting. I can do all of it. I built the thing that held Northreach together, and I can build it again, stronger, from 300 miles away, with a stroke of my pen." She paused. "But I will not do it for you." "Then for whom?" he asked. "It's my pack. It stopped being yours the night you danced it into the hands of your enemy," she said, and the words were quiet and they were merciless, and they were true. "Here are my terms, Caeldraven, and I will state them once. I will save Northreach, and in exchange, Northreach will no longer be a kingdom ruled by an alpha's fist. It will be bound by charter to the Coalhouse's trade compact, a compact of law, of ledgers, of councils, of records that anyone can read. Your pack will be fed and defended and made prosperous, and in return it will be governed the way I always governed it, in secret, out in the open at last, by competence and not by blood. You may keep your title. You may keep your hall. You will be Alpha in name, a figure the old wolves can rally behind, a face for the banners. But the coin, the grain, the law, the peace, those will run through my compact and my counsel and my hand, and you will not command them, because commands don't work on me anymore. They stopped working the night I heard what you truly thought of me. You'll rule the way you should have ruled all along, which is to say, you'll listen to the people who actually know how to keep your pack alive." The room was utterly silent. She watched the Pride war with the desperation on his face, watched the Alpha King, who had never in his life bent his neck to anyone, measure the size of what she was asking against the size of what he stood to lose. She had known men like Castle would take Northreach with an army. She had understood, in the 9 months of her rebuilding, that she could take it with a contract, and that the taking would be so total and so bloodless that no wolf would ever have to die for it. "You're asking me to hand you my crown," Kyle said hoarsely. "I'm offering to save the people wearing it while you keep the shape of it," she corrected. "There's a difference, and I suspect you know it better than most now." She heard herself echo Tarian's old words, and did not soften them. "You called Selene home because she felt soft in all the ways I never learned to be. Do you remember?" "I do. I've remembered it every day for 9 months. And do you know what I've learned in that time, Kyle? I've learned that soft is what you wanted, and hard is what you needed, and a king too foolish to tell the difference doesn't deserve to command anything, but the pups of Northreach deserve to eat. So I'll save them, under my terms or not at all. You have until I finish this cup of tea to decide." She poured herself tea from the pot at her elbow, unhurried, her hand perfectly steady, and she drank it while the Alpha King of Northreach sat at the far end of the long table and confronted the total wreckage of his pride and his choices and his life. His men said nothing. There was nothing for them to say. The oldest of them, a grey-muzzled warrior who had served Kyle's father before him, looked at Elara with something that was not resentment, but recognition, and gave her the smallest nod, and she understood that at least one of them had always known who really ran Northreach. "Why?" Kyle said suddenly, and his voice broke on the word. "Why would you do this? Save them, save any of it, after what I did to you. You owe Northreach nothing. You owe me less than nothing. You could let Castell take it all, and it would be no more than I deserve." "Why?" Elara set down her cup, and here, at last, she let a little warmth into her voice, because this was the one thing she wanted him to carry out of that room and back down the 300 miles to his failing hall, the one truth she needed him to understand all the way to the bottom of his ruined pride. "Because the pups didn't dance with your enemy," she said. "Because the families who'll starve this winter never once called me anything but Luna, and they meant it. Because I spent 4 years loving that pack, even when the pack's king didn't love me. And love like that doesn't vanish just because it stops being returned. I'm not saving Northreach for you, Kyle. I never did anything for you. Not really. I did it for them, and I was too young and too frightened to see the difference. I see it now." She stood, and she was very calm, and she was, in that moment, more of a queen than she had ever been in Silver and Moonstone. "You threw away the one person who could keep your world standing, and the cruelest part, the part I think you'll lie awake with for the rest of your life, is that she still won't let your world fall, because unlike you, she keeps her promises to the people who trusted her. That's the difference between us. You loved being a king. I loved the kingdom. Only one of those loves ever kept a single pup fed through a single winter." Kyle Draven bowed his head, and when he lifted it again, there were tears on the face of the Alpha King, and he didn't try to hide them. "I'll sign," he said. "Whatever you put in front of me. I'll sign all of it." And then, so quietly she almost missed it, "I'm sorry. It's worth nothing, I know that. But I'm sorry, Elara. I knew what you were, and I threw it away, and I've spent every day since learning the exact weight of what I lost." "I know," she said, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she believed him, and that it changed nothing, and that both of those things could be true at once. "Duty calls, Your Majesty. Let's save your pack." The charter took 3 days to draw up, and Elara wrote most of it herself, in the same clear, careful hand she had once used to leave grain distributions on a writing desk for a pack that couldn't be bothered to read them. This time they would read them. This time the reading would be the law. Tarion Cole reviewed every clause and added his own weight to the compact, and when it was done, the trade house of Cole and the pack of Northreach were bound together in a partnership that made Elara Vane, in all but title, the true sovereign of the Eastern Reaches, not through a bond or a marriage or a crown handed down by blood, but through a document she had earned line by line with the sharpest mind on the river. Vaughan Castell never got his war. He had planned for teeth and armies, and the slow starvation of a proud pack, and instead he found the border he'd been bleeding shored up overnight with coal grain and coal coin and coal-armed wolves, and the false Ashfell raiders exposed by an accounting so precise that the real Ashfell clan, presented with the evidence Elara sent them, turned their fury on the northern lord who had worn their colours to Shamelifter. The peace she had brokered 4 years before came back to life in a single season, stronger than it had ever been, because now it was written down where no proud Alpha's temper could break it. Castel, patient cold Castel, waited for a collapse that simply never came, and found himself, in the end, the isolated one, a schemer whose great design had been undone not by an army, but by the very woman he'd been clever enough to identify and foolish enough to think he could remove. She never faced him across a battlefield. She beat him with a ledger from 300 miles away, and he never even got to meet the enemy who had ruined him. She thought that was rather fitting. As for Selene, Elara heard, months later, the last chapter of the woman who had once braided her hair. Castel, defeated and humiliated, and looking for someone to blame, had turned on the agent whose work had, in the end, achieved nothing lasting, and had cast her out of his northern court with the same coldness he'd shown Northreach. Selene, who had traded a lifelong friendship and a queen's trust for a powerful man's promises, ended precisely where such bargains always end. With nothing, belonging to no one, an instrument discarded the moment it had ceased to be useful, exactly as she had helped make Elara feel on a moonlit night that now seemed to have happened to some other, softer woman in some other, smaller life. Elara felt no satisfaction in it. She felt, if anything, a distant and weary pity. Selene had sold everything real for the illusion of belonging to power, and Elara had learned, at the cost of her own heart, that power you belong to is only ever a cage, and power you build is the only kind that keeps you free. She never went back to Thornmoor. There was no need. The pack was governed now through her council and her charter, and it thrived under the open version of the same care she had once given it in secret. The pups fed, the stores full, the peace holding, the ledgers clear. Kyle Draven ruled in name, a chastened figurehead who had learned, too late and at the cost of everything, to listen to the people who knew more than he did. She corresponded with him, occasionally, on matters of trade and governance, in letters that were unfailingly courteous and entirely without warmth, and she noticed over the seasons that his letters grew wiser, more careful, more humble, as though a man could be remade by the daily contemplation of his own worst mistake. Perhaps he could. She hoped so, for the pack's sake. But she never once mistook his growth for a reason to go back, because the woman who had loved him had died in a moonlit archway, and the woman who had risen in her place had far too much respect for what she'd built to trade it for the ashes of what she'd lost. She and Tarion Cole never married. She was done with bonds that could be used against her. But they built something better than a marriage, a partnership of true equals that spanned the river and the reaches and made them both wealthy and, more importantly, made them both free. He respected her mind and her hands and her refusal to be anyone's Luna, and she trusted him precisely because he had never once wanted her to be less than she was. On the long evenings, they would sit over the ledgers of their growing enterprise, and sometimes, looking out at the lights of Solhaven reflected in the wide, dark river, Elara would think of the golden thread that had once tied her to another wolf's soul, and how much it had hurt when it frayed, and how that severing, which had felt like death, had in fact been the first true breath of her life. Because this was the thing she understood now, the hard-won knowledge she would have given the frightened Luna of 4 years ago, if she could have reached back through time to that trembling girl in the silver gown. Worth is not a gift that power bestows on you. It is not a collar clasped around your throat by someone who claims to love you, and it is not a title the pack chants at a coronation, and it is not the reflected glory of standing beside a king. Worth is the thing you carry out the low gate in the dark with nothing but a satchel and a vow. It is the competence in your own 2 hands. It is the resilience that lets you ride into an unknown country and build a fortress out of your own cleverness and your own refusal to break. They can take your crown, your bond, your name, your home. They cannot take what you actually are unless you let them convince you that you were never anything without them. That was the lie Kyle had told her without ever saying it aloud, the lie Selene had whispered, the lie Vaughan Castell had built his whole cold scheme upon. That Elara Vane was only valuable as long as she belonged to something bigger than herself. She had spent 9 months and every ounce of her strength proving it false, and she had proven it so completely that the men who had discarded her had, in the end, come crawling 300 miles to beg the very woman they'd thrown away to save them from the ruin they'd made without her. She never gloated. She had promised herself that, in the dark, and she kept the promise, because gloating was a small person's satisfaction, and she had made herself into something far too large for it. She simply lived and thrived and built and let the fact of her flourishing be the only answer the world ever needed. The Alpha King had danced with her best friend and called a stranger home, and 9 months later he had learned, in a receiving room above a bright, cold river, exactly why she'd left, and exactly what he'd surrendered. Not a soft and grateful wife, but the single most formidable mind in the eastern reaches, a woman who could unmake a kingdom by simply declining to hold it up. He had learned it too late to keep her. That was the point. That was always the point. Some lessons can only be taught by loss, and some doors, once you walk out of them into the freedom of the cold, you never walk back through again. If this story moved you, if you felt that golden thread fray in your own chest, if you stood in that moonlit archway with her and rode out that low gate into the dark, if her cold, quiet triumph made something in you sit up a little straighter, then do this one thing before you go. Give it a like, so the story finds the next person who needs to hear it. Share it with someone in your life who has been made to feel small by people too foolish to see their worth. Because they need the reminder that the crown was never the thing that made them valuable. They were. Subscribe and join this community of people who believe that the discarded rise, that quiet strength outlasts loud power, and that the best revenge is a life built so completely on your own terms that the ones who wronged you have to look up just to see how far you've climbed. And tell me in the comments, if you had been Elara, standing in that archway with the music playing and your whole world turning to ash, would you have picked up that fallen collar? Or would you have walked out into the dark like she did and never looked back? Would you have found the strength to leave, or would you have stayed and tried one more time to make yourself small enough to be loved? There is no wrong answer. There is only the truth of where you are on your own road, and I would truly love to know it. Because Elara's story was never really about a broken bond or a foolish king or a scheming friend. It was about the moment every one of us faces, sooner or later, when someone we trusted shows us exactly how little they think we're worth. And we get to decide, in the cold quiet that follows, whether to believe them. She chose not to believe them. She chose to walk out the low gate and carry her own worth into an unknown country and build it into something no one could ever take from her again. and in the end, the very people who had discarded her had to kneel just to speak her name. So remember this: wherever you are tonight, whatever archway you're standing in, whatever golden thread you feel fraying in your own chest, the crown was never the thing that made you valuable. The title, the bond, the place at someone else's side, none of it was ever the source of your worth. You are. You always were. And the day you finally believe that all the way to the bottom of your lungs is the day you take your first true breath, just as Alara did on a cold road under white stars, riding south toward a life that was finally, wholly, unbreakably her own. Thank you for staying with her to the very end. If she moved you, you know what to do. Like, share, and subscribe, and come back tomorrow, because there is always another discarded soul waiting to rise, and I will be here to tell you how they did it. Until then, go and build the kind of life they'll have to look up to see.